Welcome back to Public Affairs on Peach. Political strategists Rashad Ritchie, David Johnson are back joining us, and we are discussing Tuesday's big runoff election, where Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle and Secretary of State Brian Kemp are vying to be the Republican gubernatorial candidate in November's big election. What do you think is going to be the big deciding factor on the winner of this race?
I think the big deciding factor for voters going in is who do they trust, who do they feel is the most Donald Trump-like candidate, and hands down, that's Brian Kemp.
And in a sense of irony, it's Cagle who has been running commercials saying, I'm more like Trump. I get things done. Obviously, you got to pull those commercials now, but I agree. Whoever can excite the base and align themselves with President Donald Trump wins a Georgia Republican primary.
Exactly. I mean, I think the game's over right now. I think the Cagle campaign knows it as well. There really doesn't seem any way that Casey Cagle can turn this around. I would say right now we're probably looking at a 60-40 race for Brian Kemp.
All right. Well, one thing that Cagle has been bringing up in the debate is the security breach that actually happened on Kemp's watch. Let's listen to this audio.
As the Secretary of State, you obviously have had a number of issues that have come forward. Number one is that there was over 6 million Social Security numbers that were released, and sadly enough, you've got a record of blaming that.
We've never been hacked. I haven't released or given out anybody's Social Security numbers.
All right. What did you think about that little back and forth?
Republicans have forgiven him for it. The truth is, it's not an issue that resonates generally with voters, even though the data was at risk. My data was at risk, yours. Nothing really happened so adverse to people that individuals would still blame the Secretary of State for it. So they've digested it, and it's a done issue for most voters.
We've had voting machine issues that people have been concerned
Right.
about. They've forgotten about all of that?
It really doesn't register with the Republican voters. They're looking at issues that, really generate enthusiasm, and they're looking for a reason, too, to vote against Casey Cagle because they see him as the creature of the swamp. He's been around so long. And that Clay Tippins tape gave it to them, and it was something they heard in Casey Cagle's own voice. When you talk about the voting hacks, that's something that really is intangible. They can't put a face on it. They don't hear a voice. There's no human feeling. I think that's an issue, though, that could come back to haunt Brian Kemp in this general election if he's the nominee.
And one thing you brought up, Rashad, is just Cagle elected to the state senate at the age of 28, then elected lieutenant governor in 2006. He made history as Georgia's first ever Republican lieutenant governor, and then re-election 2010, 2014. So familiarity is there with him. People are used to him. You think that is a problem? He's too much of the establishment.
He's way too much of the establishment for a Republican primary that's in an anti-establishment mentality. Okay, that's why he attempted to align himself with Donald J. Trump, the president, because President Trump is absolutely anti-establishment. So it didn't work. It didn't come across. It didn't resonate. And the tapes coming out really put the nail in the coffin for his campaign.
I totally agree. Both parties are now going to their base voters. I think that's why Stacey Abrams was so successful on the Democratic side, and I think it's why Brian Kemp is surging at this point as well, because both candidates appeal to the base. Casey Cagle is more your general election candidate. He's the creature of the swamp in the views of a lot of Trump voters, and that hurts him.
And we talked about the commercials and how they ran. Brian Kemp's commercials with, Big Gun and Jake, who's dating his daughter.
And it all worked.
It did.
It all worked. Yeah. And there were no questions. We found out Jake is an actor, a Christian actor,
Right.
but it all worked for him.
It did. They were very careful. They targeted what the key issues are to the Trump base, and they really hit them strong, and they were emotional, and they were very effective. Cagle's campaigns were more like, I deserve the gold watch. I've been around so long. He reminds me in many ways of Mitt Romney in 2012. And we saw how that worked out for him. He didn't generate the base, and while he was the strongest Republican candidate, he never solidified the Republican base to help him further.
As a professor, I teach psychology of leadership. And one of the things I tell my students is that when you make a sale, you're making an emotional sale or a technical sale. Kemp made the emotional sale. Cagle made the technical sale. The emotional sale is what people bought.
As political strategists, what would you have told both candidates they needed to do for these campaigns?
My first thing would have been avoid meeting with Clay Tippins for Casey Cagle. But seriously, that, and I would have told him seriously to find some issues that will generate with the base voters. You have to realize this is a different Republican Party from when Nathan Deal and Karen Handel battled it out. And you need to appeal to this Trump base emotionally. With Brian Kemp, he's run a picture-perfect campaign for the Republican primary, not necessarily for the general election, perhaps.
I would say make sure you're surveying the people who will actually vote, excuse me, in a Republican primary. I think Kemp did it. I think the reason why Kemp came out with these commercials is because his campaign hired a firm who could pinpoint the pulse of the Republican voter in a primary. And Casey Cagle, they may have hired a firm, but obviously they did not get the same information. When Kemp initiated his campaign, he knew this is how I have to sell it. And that's why Cagle was even caught saying, man, I have to run a campaign of who can appeal to the craziest. That's because he's reacting to Kemp's style.
Exactly, because you used to, as a Republican, run to the right, but not to the far right, and then move back to the center for the general election. No longer do you do that. It's all about the base vote turning out.
All right, gentlemen, we've got some other races to talk about. We're going to take a break. Coming up, we're going to discuss the runoff between another pair of Republicans hoping to get to run for lieutenant governor in November's election. We'll be right back.